where they strung up a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. I seem to have managed to pick up some kind of a little bug. Got sinus problems. I'll try not to cough into the mic. If I do, I'm sorry. If I'm going to let a little thing like a cold stop me from doing the show, well, oh well. Anyone who's listened to more than 2 of my shows should know that I love coffee and I love books. Books and coffee go together like spooky old houses and ghosts. Although all spooky old houses aren't necessarily haunted, and some ghosts like to hang out in new homes. As far as I know, the Organic Man Coffee Trike is not haunted, but they do have the best coffee on the planet. 4501 McPherson to get heaven in a cup. If it's too far to drive, go to organicmancoffeetrike.shop. My cat's trying to eat my telephone. They also sell some of my books, so you can buy a book and drink a cup of coffee at the same time. Back in ancient times, it was common practice, if there were scrolls or books that might offend someone, the folks in charge, especially, they would set fire to the library, or sometimes the entire city. The Nazis were big into book burning. They destroyed any books that went against their community standards. A bunch of middle ranking officers would get together and they would decide which books they didn't like, and then they would pile them up in the middle of a plaza somewhere. They would get their minions, the violent guys, the brown shirts, to stomp around, yelling and screaming and waving torches, and then they would set everything on fire. Kind of reminds me of some of the nonsense going on today. By controlling knowledge, the Nazis could control most of Europe. Today, we have groups of middle management lackeys that kind of think the same way. They don't like something, they're afraid that it offends them, and so they make it go away. It's funny how history just repeats itself. On occasion, I'll be doing research for one of my shows, and I'll read something on the internet, and I'll think, wait a minute, that's not how I remember it. So I'll go back and I'll read one of my reference books. And sure enough, something has been changed. Just 'cause it's in a book, written down in black and white, and it's fiction, doesn't mean that it doesn't have something to teach you. A lot of the best knowledge can be accomplished by reading fictional books. Just because a book is nonfiction doesn't mean that the author isn't maybe possibly lying to you. There are lots of books out there not worth the paper they're printed on. In 1777, Frederick the Great of Prussia issued a manifesto claiming that beer was superior to coffee. The reason behind this move was people drinking beer were seen singing and punching each other in the nose and stumbling around at night, but that was about it. They couldn't think about much since their brains were saturated with alcohol. People hanging out in coffee houses were seen discussing things like why pay taxes to some guy just 'cause he claims that his family was royalty. In 1799, the Industrial Revolution was kicked off after people had begun drinking coffee instead of beer. As soon as their brains dried out, they could think again. Nowadays, I see that there are people out there that are disparaging the Industrial Revolution as if it was a bad thing. I guess they wish they lived in the good old days, back when everybody lived in a mud hut and drank a lot of beer and died from relatively easy diseases to cure today. I guess they like the idea of wearing a wool outfit, scratchy, itchy. The only way you could get it to not itch was to soak it in urine. You've heard the expression not having a bucket to go in? Well, that's what they used it for. Ooh, the good old days. Everybody smelled like ick. Words have no power on their own. The old sticks and stones saying. The words had to be spoken in the right way, the right order, the right amount of verbal energy. Just a bunch of words until paired together and spoken by the proper person in the right way. Incantations Incantations are spells, charms, enchantments, or bewitcheries. An incantation is a magical formula intended to trigger a magical effect on a person or an object. The formula can be spoken, sung, or chanted. An incantation can also be performed during ceremonial rituals or prayers. Things like sticking a crown on some guy's head and declaring that he's now king. It isn't proper for anyone to just grab a crown and slap it on and say, I'm the king. No, there has to be ritual, a ceremony, magic. The whole scone of stone ceremony in Britain comes to mind. Did I say that wrong? The scone of stone? Not if you're a Terry Pratchett book enthusiast. In the fifth elephant, the scone of stone is the most famous form of dwarf bread. It has seated the low kings of the dwarves since it was first created by Brian Bladax 1500 years ago. The low king cannot be low king without this artifact. Tragedy comes when the scone is stolen from its hiding place. The belief is that the truth was once something solid, like a stone, and the last piece of it was hidden by Aggie Hammer Thief and baked into the scone. Because the scone contains a grain of truth, it is said to burn red hot if a lie is told in its presence. Terry Pratchett was born in 1948 and had his first story published when he was 13. After leaving school at 17 to become a journalist, he continued writing, publishing his first novel, The Carpet People. He went on to produce a phenomenal successful Discworld series. The Discworld is a fictional setting of Terry Pratchett's most iconic series. All the Discworld novels take place on a flat, circular world which sits on the back of four elephants, which are standing on the back of a giant sea turtle named Atun. The Discworld novels explore a multitude of very human issues. If you've never read the Discworld, this is what it looks like right here. Now, that's Atun at the very bottom, and the four elephants and Discworld. There are 41 Discworld novels. The great thing about these books is you don't have to read them in order. Uh, a word of caution. The last couple of books, Making Steam, I think was the very last one, weren't quite up to par. When I read them, I was like, it looks like the great writer, Terry, has run out of ideas, maybe. It's hard to be funny over and over and over. Well, then I discovered that he was suffering from Alzheimer's and he died in 2015. So apparently, even with that horrible disease, he was still trying to knock out his books. Terry Pratchett's daughter, Rihanna, said neither she nor any other writer will continue to write novels that are set in the Discworld. The hard drive from his computer, which contained at least 10 unpublished stories in various stages of completion, was removed, taken to a festival. It's called the Dorset Steam Fair, laid on the ground, and then run over by a huge steamroller named Lord Jericho, a 6.5 ton steamroller. The disc proved to be a bit sturdier than anybody expected, so they drove over it a couple of times, and then they threw it into a steam-powered stone crusher just to make sure the hard drive was gone. This was Mr. Pratchett's request concerning his unfinished works. I guess he figured if he couldn't finish 'em, nobody else should. Some might say that he just entertained people. He wrote fiction and fantasy. If you're like me, when reading a really entertaining book, what I call a good book, your brain gets engaged. You begin thinking. Your mind wanders about the planet, the galaxy, the universe. You think about things you just read that bring you to thinking other things. The idea of how, in making money, the hero, Moist, Moist von Lipwig, discovers something astonishing about the monetary system. I'm not going to spoil the story for those of you that haven't read the book, and those of you that have, you know what I'm talking about. You can't help but see a similarity between fiction and the world today. I've read maybe half of Mr. Pratchett's books. Not that I don't want to read them all, but I have a shelf behind me that is full of books that I have yet to read. His writings have helped shape my weird sense of humor, probably helped shape a lot of weird senses of humor. Today, when I see something going on out there, instead of thinking, well, that's kind of odd, I think of it as I saw something like that in a book I read once. And then I think about how things might change. Another writer I follow is Jasper Fforde, and he spells it with two F's. He wrote Shades of Grey, which I mentioned last week. I read this book a few times, 2 or 3 times actually. It first came out in 2008, but I didn't get my copy until 2009. I read it, and then I patiently waited for the next story to come out. Jasper said he was working on a sequel. I waited, and I waited, eventually not very patiently, but I waited. After talking about the book last week, I got to wondering whatever became of Eddie Russett and Jane Grey. The story ended, but it also kind of hung there. I looked online and I discovered that the sequel is coming out. It is coming to a bookstore near you soon. Red Side Story should be out in May of 2024. Only 16 years late. I don't feel so bad about taking 4 years to write UFOs Attack the Bag Company. That only took me 4 years. Jasper Fforde also wrote the Thursday Next series. Thursday is a literary detective. She investigates forged manuscripts. In her adventures, The Air Affair, Thursday discovers that she can enter books. Inside, she finds every book ever written is a real place in the book universe. You have to have kind of a working knowledge of classic literature to follow some of the stories, but if not, just pretend like you know what they're talking about. He also wrote The Nursery Crimes, stories like The Big Over Easy and The Fourth Bear. Ford also had a huge effect on my sense of humor. I think I've read all of his books, including the children's books. Of course, talking about books just wouldn't be right without mentioning Douglas Adams and his story, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I not only have one copy, I think I have three. I used to watch the show back when British comedy was being introduced to the US. Monty Python's Flying Circus, Faulty Towers, The Young Ones. Oh, yes, most of what I know about British comes from watching those shows. I might just have a weird idea on what goes on across the pond. To me, anytime I hear anything about England or Scotland or any of those countries, I immediately envision a Monty Python skit. Douglas Adams used to write for Doctor Who back when it was still worth watching. Adams had some ideas on life, the universe, and, everything. I don't agree with a lot of what he thought. His politics were nothing like mine. It doesn't mean that I can't enjoy his books. Too many people today think if somebody disagrees with them, they're the enemy and they must be canceled. 100% agreement or nothing at all. Who gave them these ideas? Probably the same folks that they claim they're fighting. Adams also wrote Dirk Gently, Holistic Detective Agency, The Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul. He co-wrote The Meaning of Life, The Deeper Meaning of Life, and Last Chance to See. There are those who tell me they don't get his brand of humor. They've seen the movie or they read part of the book and then they stopped reading, saying it doesn't appeal to them. These are probably the same folks who don't listen to my show. I realize I'm an acquired taste. Few will ever have. I'm not for the masses, I'm for those that want to listen. If a person's not interested in what I'm saying, go listen to somebody else. There are thousands of podcasts out there. I was talking about magic a few minutes ago. I am not a wizard or a magician. I have known a few people that said they were. I knew a couple of gals back in Seabrook that said they had been inducted, I think that's the word, into a coven. This was while they were doing a little bit of jail time, like in a couple of years. I have talked to a few folks and read a lot of books on the subject. All I can say is this is what I was told on the subject of magic. Incantations are spells that are typically performed with a wand and can be cast either verbally or non-verbally. You don't need a wand either, but it's supposed to help direct the energy to where you want it to go. Say you're turning somebody into a newt or you're trying to reheat your coffee. The wand helps get the energy where it's supposed to go. Nonverbal spells are those typically performed with a wand, but without saying the incantation out loud. The advantage of nonverbal spells is they allow the spellcaster to gain an element of surprise. Nonverbal spells require enormous concentration and mind power, with the spellcaster having to summon the spell just using their mind. Where does the energy come from? Mother Nature is one answer. Ley lines is another. A lot of ancient sacred sites were located on ley lines, especially where two or more came together. Wizards and witches relied heavily on their spell book, handwritten over years, decades, sometimes even centuries. The books were closely guarded, holding a lot of the power in the form of words. The old books were written on vellum. Paper, especially cheap modern stuff, will fall apart in about 75 years. The chemicals used to bind the pulp together and make the pages white slowly breaks down, turning the pages into bits and pieces of yellowy looking stuff. Vellum is made from goat or sheepskin. There are stories out there that say the best books on magic are written on human skin. Once again, this is just what I've been told. Books made from vellum will last for centuries. Any mistakes are corrected by carefully scraping the ink from the surface and then rewriting the letter or word. If the ink is too deeply embedded, the entire section can be cut out and a new piece is glued in or stitched in. You have to correct both sides of the page if you do that. In the 13th century in Bohemia, a man named Herman, he was a monk named Herman, committed an unforgivable abomination. He broke his sacred vow, and therefore he received the death sentence. They don't say which vow it was that he broke, but they did find him guilty. The monk was facing immurement, meaning he was going to be bricked up alive behind the monastery's wall. Just before the final brick was put in place, the monk begged for mercy. The abbot offered him a deal. The monk was challenged to create a book that would include all of the world's knowledge, and he was to do it in a single night. It sounds to me like the abbot knew this was impossible, and the monk was going to be walled up anyway. Why he did it, no one knows. Herman knew this was a losing proposition, but he also had a plan. Summoning a demon, maybe even the devil himself, Herman sold his soul in exchange for the ability to do as the abbot had said. As the sun was peeking over the horizon, Herman presented the abbot with the Codex Gigas. 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 I don't speak Latin. The book is signed Hermanus Inclusus, which translates as Hermanus is Herman, the monk's name, and inclusus means either punishment or voluntary isolation. In Latin, the Codex Gigas means the giant book. It is 36 inches tall, 20 inches wide, 9 inches thick, and it weighs 165 pounds. The binding consists of leather and ornamental metal. Each page shows impeccable precision and detail. The book includes the entire Latin Bible, Isidore of Seville's Encyclopedia Entomology, Josephus Antiquus, Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, the Cosmos of Prague's Chronicles of Bohemia. The book also includes writings on magic, exorcism ritual. It's not an exercise book. Exorcism rituals and a calendar. All that in one night. The old medieval belief states that it is a possible way to atone for your sins if you copy holy texts. That belief could support the. I just had a cat go zipping by like a comet. That belief could support the theory of the monk's redemption. How a demon would be willing to copy the Bible is one of those things. You'd think copying the holy text would destroy the demon, or maybe he turned out to be like Beelzebub. If y'all listen to Vic Hermanson, you'll know who I'm talking about. Herman, or the demon, wrote a long list of sins in the form of a confession. This is placed just before the hand drawn depiction of heaven. The text differs from the rest of the Codex Gigas. It is written all in capital letters, as if being yelled in modern text. The monk begs for forgiveness across 5 pages, describing his every sin in detail. Back in the Dark Ages, many people were drawn to the church to become closer to God. Some went into monasteries and convents as a way of being able to eat and have a place to sleep. A few slipped in while hiding from the authorities. A lot of the royals sent their kids away as a form of either locking them up out of the public view or as a means of punishment. Not all monks and nuns were nice folks. There were a few bad apples. The Codex Gigas has a full-scale representation of heaven and of the devil. This particular sheet makes Codex Gigas the only medieval manuscript with a full-page portrait of the devil. The beast is shown in an empty landscape standing between two towers. The devil has been depicted in a lot of different forms. He's shown as looking like a snake in many paintings. In the original Hebrew text, the creature who convinces Adam and Eve to eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil isn't named. Satan in the Hebrew Bible means adversary, obstacle, or enemy, and can refer to a human antagonist or a supernatural entity. In the New Testament, Satan is referred to as being a serpent. Jesus referred to Satan as the father of lies. The devil perverted the truth, as he did with Eve. He fills our minds with doubt. He provides all of the rationalizations why something is right, even though our Lord and the church teaches it is wrong. The Lateran Council stated, "The devil and the other demons were indeed created naturally good by God, but they became evil by their own doing." There's a lot in the Bible that is a bit hard to understand. That's why so many people keep coming up with ideas on what God wants us to do. Go kill those folks known as the Gnostics. Go capture Jerusalem. Go burn all those folks known as witches. The Bible is the most popular book ever written. Yeah, I tell people I have an autographed copy. Some of them don't catch that one. The codex shows a creature staring from the blackness of the page, drawn with red horns and 2 tongues, wearing nothing but an ermine loincloth. Ermine was worn only by the royals. So this detail defines the devil as the prince of darkness, or at least some royal. The Codex Gigas is known as the Devil's Bible. Right by the illustration of the devil is the depiction of heaven, presented through numerous rows of white buildings. Paradise lies between 2 towers as well. In that way, it is linked to the devil's portrait. What makes the kingdom of heaven unsettling is the fact that there's no sign of life anywhere. Without explanation, the author drew heaven utterly empty. The double page spread depicts the very nature of good and evil, standing side by side. These illustrations are the only full page drawings in the codex. Pages that follow contain writings describing certain magical spells and demonic conjurings. These texts were supposedly intended for exorcism rituals. They were meant to repel illness and hallucinations. If the book was written by a demon, why would he or it tell us how to defeat his kind? This isn't like what happened with King Solomon encountering a demon. The monk had agreed to sell his soul in exchange for this book. According to experts, all of the writing and the artwork in the codex belong to a single person or being. The part that was capitalized was still the same guy, probably done this way to show just how desperate he was to reclaim his soul. It was common practice for scribes to collaborate with multiple illustrators. No other books created to Hermann have ever been found. The Codex Gigas comes with a problem, the curse of the Devil's Bible. In 1477, the Benedictine monastery in Bohemia was in bad shape financially. Monasteries supported themselves by offering goods like wine or vegetables that they would sell. Some received money from some royal trying to stay in good graces with God, while he or she went about killing and pillaging. As kings died and others took over, they sometimes decided they didn't want all their cash going to some monastery or some convent somewhere, and they would simply just stop supporting them. Needing money, the monks at the Bohemian monastery sold off works of art and manuscripts. The codex was sold to the Benedictine monastery in Bevnov. Soon afterwards, the Bohemian monastery fell during the havoc of the Hussite Revolution. The manuscript remained in Brevnov until 1593. The monastery decided to lend the book to the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II. The codex was never returned to the monastery because the emperor developed an obsession for it. As his fascination grew, his reign was affected by his paranoia. The emperor began seeing meanings in the manuscript that he associated as being just for him. It was it was as if the book was there to guide him. It wasn't long before the emperor's family decided to overthrow him. This was how many royals ascended to the throne: either kill the current king or have him removed somehow. 6 years following the emperor's death, the 30-Year War got kicked off. The war ended with the Swedish army taking the emperor's library, including the codex. 1697, a fire broke out in the royal castle of Stockholm. Moments before the flames reached the royal library, the chief librarian ordered his men to salvage as many precious works as possible. The men had no time to carry books and documents down the stairs and out the door, so they simply began throwing everything out the window. Many people believed when the 165-pound manuscript was heaved out the window, it flew through the air, and that 10 pages were magically torn from the bindings. These mysterious pages remain missing to this day. 3 days after the incident, there was an investigation to determine the cause of the fire. It was discovered that the chief fire watch and his 2 assistants were not where they were supposed to be. They received a death penalty. The cause of the fire was never discovered. Castles had huge stone walls around the perimeter. Most of the buildings were made from stone, but the interior was all wood. As wood dries out, it becomes very susceptible to fire. And add to this fireplaces, candles, lanterns, and a total lack of fire retardants, you have a bonfire just waiting to happen. There are a few theories as to what became of and why the missing pages were removed. One is they simply pertained to the rules of the Bohemian monastery and were of little consequences to anyone after that. Others think the pages contained some really powerful spells or magic, and they were removed either by someone wanting to possess them or somebody wanting to keep this knowledge away from the wrong people. Did you see the movie The Name of the Rose? It came out in 1986. It's a story from the 14th century. William of Baskerville, who's played by Sean Connery, and he's a renowned Franciscan monk, and his apprentice, Adso of Melk, that is played by Christian Slater. They travel to an abbey where a suspicious death has occurred. Using his detective powers, William begins investigating what he believes to be a murder. During the course of his investigation, several more monks turn up dead. It turns out that each of the dead guys was reading a book on humor that was considered to be dangerous. So the chief librarian had soaked the pages with poison. As the monks were reading the book, they would lick one finger so they could turn the page. This ingesting small amounts of poison until enough was in them to kill. Humor has changed considerably over the ages. I have a copy of Saki by H. H. Munro. Hector Hugh Munro was born in 1870. He wrote what at the time was considered humor. I've read a lot of his work, and to be fair, it's very hard read. The things that made folks laugh back then just not all that funny today. During World War I, Munro enlisted even though he was considered too old. He died in November 1916. His last words were, "Put that bloody cigarette out," just before a German sniper put a bullet in his head. His body was left where he fell. So maybe, just maybe, his spirit is still roaming the battlefield of France. I know I make a lot of references to movies. It's an easy way to get a point across in the form of something a lot of people should have seen, since Sean Connery was the star. And if you didn't like Sean Connery, there's something wrong there. Hey, 007 just isn't 007 once they took Sean Connery out of the mix. That weird movie, Zardoz. Anyway, those missing pages have been about rules of the monastery. There would have been thousands of rules instead of just hundreds. Each page was 3 feet by 2 feet and written on both sides. You can get a copy of the Codex for $13. It's in the form of a DVD and not translated. So all you'll see is page after page after page of Latin script. You have to be able to read Latin if you want to follow the story. King Solomon was the king of David and was known for his wisdom. The Testament of Solomon is supposed to be a record of his supernatural encounters. Some scholars say that this was written hundreds of years after the king's death. Others say he had the original documents written during his lifetime, and they have been handed down and rewritten over the centuries. The Testament of Solomon begins with a story of a demon named Ornius who stole money from a worker who was building the temple. He then sucked the thumb of the man's son, sapping his strength. Solomon interrogates the boy and he discovers the demon's activities. He prays to the Lord for help, and Archangel Michael gives Solomon a ring which will allow him to imprison the demon. Solomon gives the ring to the boy, and thus they trap the demon. The boy turns demon over to Solomon, who interrogates it and learns his name is Orneus. Solomon tells Orneus asks him where he lives, and he is told that he lives in one of the zodiac signs. Solomon prays to the archangel Auriel, who imprisons the demon and forces him to work cutting stones to build Solomon's temple. Once the temple was complete, Solomon gives the magical ring to the demon, commanding that he bring the prince of demons to Solomon. And not the devil, but just another high ranking demon. Solomon then compiles a list of demons' names and a suggested method for exorcising them. His book provides an extensive catalog of 72 demons, each with its own name, appearance, and specific power. These demons are said to cause illness, possess individuals, or disrupt natural phenomenon. The book also tells how Solomon was able to communicate with animals, commune with spirits, and build the Temple of Jerusalem with the assistance of supernatural beings. I wonder if JJ from Southern Demonology has ever looked into this document. How about Vic Hermanson, a Trailer Trash Terrors? Is a lot like Strange Things if I had better equipment and I did more editing. Plus, having characters like his cybernetic pal Boudreaux, Beelzebubba, who I mentioned earlier, Annabelle Lee, the little girl that sings the intro and exit music for my show, and Wilbur, the ethereal pest control specialist. Check it out and see what a good podcast sounds like. And you might want to check out Southern Demonology as well. Tell JJ I said hello. Like that'll do any good. He'll go, "Who?" The Grand Grimoire is a book or a text of instructions for use in ceremonial magic. It was edited by Antonio del Rabina from a copy transcribed from the genuine works of King Solomon. The Grand Grimoire is divided into two parts. The first contains the evocation of Lucifuge Rosafal, and the second concerns with the rite of making pacts with demons. Lucifuge Rochefort is featured only in the one text, the Grand Grimoire, a French magical handbook of black magic written in the 17th and 18th century. Rochefort may be an anagram for Focalaire, a demon that is named in the Lemegeton, a book written by King Solomon. When I say written, it's kind of like how all these celebrities have books out that they say they wrote. You see their picture on the cover and there's their name, like they actually wrote the thing. More than likely, they pay somebody to write it for them, and then they just jot their Hancock down on it. And I'll bet some of them never even read the book. That's how rich people do it, and celebrities. They ain't got time to write a 500 or 800 page biography. King Solomon would have had scribes working for him that did all the ink dipping and point sharpening. He just put his name at the bottom. Antonio del Rabina found copies of old scrolls from back when Solomon was king. He was able to translate and copy these scrolls into modern books. Of course, a lot of historians say that this never happened. Is it because they believe it didn't happen, or they were told it never happened? History is not written by the victors. It's written by the folks with the money. You know, the golden rule. Gald Galdrabok Galdabrok is an Icelandic book of magic. It was written in the 1600s. It contains 47 spells written in Latin and Icelandic. There are runic material as well as Icelandic magical staves, invocations to Christian entities, demons, and the Norse gods, as well as instructions for the use of herbs and magical items. Some of these spells are protective, intended to work against problems such as trouble with childbirth, headaches, insomnia, previous incantations, in other words, to block somebody else's spell, pestilence, suffering, and distress at sea, mal de mer, seasickness. How come no paint company has ever come up with a mal de mer green? I think that'd be a cool color. Others are intended to cause fear, kill animals, find thieves, put someone to sleep, cause flatulence. That's a good one. That's a spell I'd like to have. Or bewitch women. The grimoire was compiled by four people, possibly starting in the late 16th century and going on until the mid 17th. The first three scribes were Icelanders, and the fourth was a Dane working from Icelandic materials. An English translation was published in 1989 by Stephen Flowers, and a facsimile edition with detailed commentary by Matthias Vor Simondsson in 1992. In 1995, Flowers produced a second retitled edition of his book, and with the assistance of Simondsson, who corrected many of the translations and added many more notes and comments. If you have a book on spells that was translated from one language to another, how can you be sure you're summoning some spirit, you're saying the right words, the right way, the right hand gestures? Any small mispronunciation or the wrong word in the right place could give you huge problems. Say you want to send a being to scare your neighbor because he did something mean to you last week. As you're waving your arm over your head and summoning a retaliatory spirit, you say here instead of there. The only difference is the T. Now you have a rampaging invisible thing bounding about your house instead of making your neighbor's life interesting. This is right up there with starting an IKEA project before consulting the instructions, which are probably written in Swedish. The Black Pullet was written in French, titled Le Poulet Noir, also known as Le Poulet aux Offres d'Or. I do not speak French. Or The Hen That Lays the Golden Egg. It is a book that tries to teach the science of magical talismans and rings, as well as the art of necromancy and Kabbalah. Necromancy is the practice of magic involving communicating with the dead by summoning their spirits as apparitions or visions for the purpose of divination. The Kabbalah is an esoteric method, discipline, and a school of thought in Jewish mysticism. The Black Pullet is believed to have been written in the 18th century by an anonymous French officer who served in Napoleon's army. The text takes the place of a narrative centering on the French officer during the Egyptian expedition led by Napoleon, when his unit is suddenly attacked by Arab soldiers. The French officer manages to escape the attack, but is the only survivor. An old Turkish man appears suddenly from the pyramids and takes the French officer into a secret room within one of these structures. He nurses him back to health while sharing with him the magical teachings from an ancient manuscript that escaped the burning of the Ptolemy library. Napoleon had told the folks back home he was going to liberate Jerusalem from those godless Muslims. They then handed him a whole bunch of cash for his mission. Once in Egypt, Napoleon told the Muslims that he was there to liberate Jerusalem from those other people. After finding the Rosetta Stone, he was stopped dead once Admiral Nelson destroyed his fleet. Napoleon returned to Paris and announced, "Mission accomplished. Jerusalem is now in Christian hands," never having even gotten close to the city. He was hailed as the Savior of Jerusalem. It was one of his many titles. The Black Pullet contains instructions on the creation of a magical properties such as talismans, rings, and amulets, and how to master their extraordinary powers. The most interesting magical property claimed in the book is the Black Pullet, otherwise known as the hen that lays the golden eggs. The grimoire claims that the person who understands and attains the power to instruct the black pullet will gain unlimited wealth. The notion of such a lucrative possession has been reflected throughout history in fables, fairy tales, and folklore. How many nursery rhymes, or fairy tales, I should say, can you think of where the ultimate goal was to gain enormous wealth? What was his name? Rumpelstiltskin and the goose with the golden egg and all those characters. This text has often been associated with two other texts known as the Grand Grimoire, which is also called the Red Dragon and the Black Screech Owl. The latter is also confusingly known as the Black Pullet or the Treasure of the Old Man of the Pyramids, and is in fact an alternate printing of the original Black Pullet, with only slight changes. All three grimoires claim to possess the science of ancient magic. Even back then, people had a hard time coming up with original names for their books, like Shades of Grey and 50 Shades of Grey. Completely different books, same title, basically. Yes, that's a children's story. The goose that laid the golden egg is basically the same thing. Maybe the original story, which was from 500 BC, is the same story or the story of the same essence, only from a different encounter. Two different people both encountered this old man who told them the story of a fowl that could lay golden eggs. Sometimes similar occurrences take place. The same thing is run into by different folks at different times. Once the story is told, people get the two mixed together. Or, then again, maybe the goose laying the golden egg was passed on to that old man living inside the pyramid, who in turn passed it on to the Frenchman. The Aurea Linda book, known in Old Frisian as Thet Ora Linda Bach, came to light in 1867 when Cornelius Over de Linden handed the manuscript over to Elko Verwich. Cornelius said he inherited the manuscript from his grandfather by way of his aunt. The documents were taken to the provincial library in Friesland for translation and possible publication. Friesland is a province of the Netherlands located in the country's northern area. The book experts rejected the manuscript, saying it was not as old as claimed. In 1872, John, or is it Han Gerhardus Adama, a prominent member of the Frisian Society for History and Culture, published a Dutch translation. Atema believed it to be written in authentic Old Frisian. The book was subsequently translated into English by William Sandburg in 1876. Within the first few years after the appearance of the Aurea Linda book, its actual origins were established based on a number of anachronistic anachronisms. Boy, I'm having a hard time seeing because one eye keeps fogging up, watering up. Anyway, anachronisms are things belonging or appropriate to a period other than that in which it exists, especially a thing that is conspicuously old fashioned. A stone tablet was unearthed a while ago, and the guy that found it claimed that it was about 5,000 years old. The person holding on to this tablet pointed out the date, where it said it was written in 2000 BC. It was carved right there on the stone. Yep, 2000 B, or correction, 3000 BC. Are people really that ignorant of how to do things? But apparently so. The Aurea Linda was nevertheless a source of inspiration for a number of occultists and alternative historians. More than 40 years later, beginning in 1922, Dutch philologist Herman Wirth revived the issue. He published a German translation of what he dubbed the Nordic Bible in 1933. Because of the infatuation of Himmler with the Aurea Linda book and its consequential association with Nazi occultism, it became known as Himmler's Bible. Wirth's book was by no means universally acclaimed among the Nazi era Nordicists. In 1934, a panel discussion was steeped in heated controversy. This was back when you could disagree with the Nazis and not wind up in a camp somewhere. Alfred Rosenberg and his circle rejected the manuscript outright. Gustav Nickel had praised Wirth's work before publication, but upon seeing its contents, he revised his opinion. I guess he didn't bother reading the document before putting his praise for it in writing. The book experienced a revival of popularity in the English speaking world with the writings of Robert Scruton. In his book, The Other Atlantis, he reproduces the full text of Sandbach's 1876 English translation, interspersed with his own commentary on history and methodology. In Secrets of Lost Atlantis, he becomes the first to link the book with the concept of Earth's mysteries, and in particular, ley lines and telluric energy. Following Scruton's example, English language accounts of the Aurea Linda book tend to place it within the New Age or alternate history genre, and do not associate it with National Socialism, even though it was their Bible. Another figure to formulate a contemporary neo-pagan tradition influenced by the Aurea Linda book was Tony Steele, who considered the book to reveal the genuine truth about ancient European megalithic culture, not cults. In Water Witches, he examines the books used as a cultural identity marker by the Frisian descendants known as the Canal folks of the English Midlands. In the rites and rituals of traditional witchcraft, he connects the religious practices of the priestesses described in the book with later medieval witchcraft traditions. In Russia, 1990s, political philosopher Alexander Dugin took up the work of Herman Wirth. In his influential 1999 anthology, I'm not going to even attempt that name, it's in Russian. He views the Book of Aurea Linda as a textbook example of a deeply rooted myth of the Aryan race that can easily be transformed into a political ideology. This is exactly what he did. According to critics, the chronicle was used to support the Eurasianism, the worldview, while ironically he hated all of the stories about Atlantis. As a counterpart to Frisian history, Dugin promoted the myth of the supposedly lost Palestinian Book, or the Book of Palestine, in which Wirth is said to have described the true history of the Jewish people. In 2007, one of his students provided a Russian translation of the Oria Linda book with a detailed preface. This is almost the same story of the protocols of the elders of Zion. I have heard and read a lot of accounts of this being an actual thing. Russia's secret police used the protocols to sway public opinion against the Jews living in Russia. Pierre Ivanovich Rochkovsky fabricated the protocols in 1898 while living in Paris. He used a stage play called Napoleon III by a French lawyer named Maurice Joly, published in 1864, as the groundwork for his forgery. Still today, people will reference the protocols as being real documents. I have read numerous books by authors who seem to know what they're talking about up until the point that they start referencing the protocols. And then you start worrying about their ability to research. For those of you that follow Josh Turner on Paranormal Roundtable, he is also a writer. His book, Werewolves and the Dogman Phenomenon, came out a few months ago. His other book came out about the same time, The Bigfoot Phenomenon. These stories were all given by credible, sober eyewitnesses with no agenda other than to tell their strange truth to the public and reveal to the world the true nature of these mysterious entities known as dogmen and Bigfoot. These are not children's stories. There are no tree hugging, granola munching Harry and the Hendersons stories. Josh has kind of the same ideas that I have when it comes to Bigfoot and the Dogman. Many of the witnesses also had UFO counters as well as other cryptids. In the book, Mr. Penumbra's 24-hour bookstore, it has quite an interesting slant on reading and writing. I read this book back in 2013. The Great Recession has shuffled Clay Janin out of his life as a San Francisco web designer, and serendipity, sheer curiosity, and ability to climb a ladder has landed him a new job working as a night shift at Mr. Penumbra's 24-hour bookstore. After the first few days on the job, Clay begins to realize that the store is even more curious than the name suggests. There are only a few customers, but they never come in and buy anything. They simply borrow books, very obscure volumes from strange corners of the store, all according to some elaborate, long-standing arrangement with Mr. Penumbra. The story must be the front for something larger, he concludes. So he begins to investigate, trying to figure out what's going on. It's been a while since I read it, but I do remember how things transpired. The idea all these folks visiting the bookstore have is they are trying to gain immortality. By having their personal works written down and stored on a shelf, it's as if they will live forever. At least they'll be remembered forever. It's kind of like Mark Twain. He may have died some time ago, but just about everybody knows who Mark Twain was simply because his books are everywhere. I also read 1984 by George Orwell back in 1975. I thought at the time it was a very depressing story. Everything about it said, this is not a world that I want to live in. Guess what? We are living in the story of 1984 today. It wasn't so much a work of fiction as a tale of things to come. I wonder, how did George know the things coming from his mind to his fingertips and then on to the typewriter were going to happen? Like Nostradamus almost. Was he tapping into some advanced memory bank, sending the future to him so that he could warn us as to what our world was going to become? Or was the world formed as more and more people read his book? Kind of like one huge tulpa. I've come across a few hundred libraries. Let me try that again. I have come across a few haunted libraries and a handful of haunted bookstores. Why, if words have power or energy, aren't huge collections of books all the hiding places for spirits? It's not the words sitting there in between the pages that cause energy. It's the use of those words. It's opening the book and reading the page, even if it's just in your mind. That is where the energy comes from. Scientists have been studying the mind for 2,000 years. In the last few hundred, they say they've made some huge groundbreaking advancements in understanding. The modern scientific community understands about 2% of what the brain can do. The mind is a bizarre piece of work. Some folks even use theirs. The brain is not the home of the mind. I think it extends all beyond our physical form, maybe into what Edgar Cayce calls the Akashic records. The Gnostics believed that we already knew everything. We just couldn't access the information when we needed it. Kind of like that file you created with all your passwords in it. It's in there somewhere, you just can't remember where it is. The easiest way to remember things is to write them down on paper, not on a computer. Things written in books will get the old gray matter functioning again. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, pass it around, let other people know what they're missing. Maybe they'll like it too, or maybe they'll think you're weird for listening to me. If you'd like to support the show, go to Amazon.com and buy one or two or three of my books, and that'll give me a few bucks in the pocket. Also, if you have an idea for a book, even if you don't think it's that good of a book, write it down. Put it down on paper. That way, eventually, maybe you can become a writer too. That's how I got started. I didn't want to be a writer. It kind of just got put into my lap by my wife. So, until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where there's strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.